In the heart of Tsim Sha Tsui, neon lights cast long shadows over the densely packed streets of Hong Kong. The year is 1999. The city is a bustling metropolis, a global financial hub where the pulse of commerce never stops and millions of lives intersect every single day. The architecture is a dense forest of concrete and glass, a place where people live in incredibly close proximity, separated only by thin walls and the unspoken agreement to mind one's own business. Yet, beneath the glittering skyline and the relentless energy of the streets, there lies a complex labyrinth of human struggle. It is within this densely populated urban environment that one of the most complex and challenging investigations in the history of the Hong Kong police force would unfold. This is a story about the meticulous nature of forensic science, the heavy burden of the judicial system, and the relentless pursuit of justice for a young woman whose life was tragically cut short. To understand the magnitude of this investigation, we must first look at the life of the victim, Fan Man-yee. She was 23 years old, navigating the complexities of life in a city that demands constant resilience. Like many young people drawn to the vibrant nightlife of Hong Kong, she worked as a hostess in a local nightclub. Her life was not without its profound difficulties. She was a mother, trying to support her young child, and she was entangled in a web of economic hardship and social vulnerability. The late 1990s in Hong Kong was a period of significant transition and economic fluctuation, and individuals on the margins of society often found themselves relying on informal and sometimes dangerous networks for financial survival. Fan Man-yee became indebted to individuals operating within the fringes of the local underworld, a decision driven by desperation that would ultimately lead to a fatal confrontation. The individuals she encountered were Man-lok, Leung Shing-cho, and Leung Wai-lun. These three men operated with a profound disregard for the law and human dignity. The conflict began over a financial dispute, a relatively small sum of money and a missing wallet. However, in the shadowy corners of the criminal ecosystem, debts are rarely settled through standard mediation. Instead, these men resorted to unlawful detention and extreme coercion. In the spring of 1999, they abducted Fan Man-yee and confined her to a third-floor apartment on Granville Road. Granville Road is a vibrant commercial street, heavily trafficked by shoppers and tourists by day, and surrounded by residential flats. The fact that a severe and prolonged crime could occur in such a heavily populated area speaks to the isolating nature of modern urban living. For over a month, Fan Man-yee was held captive in that apartment. During this period, she was subjected to a systematic and relentless campaign of physical abuse and severe deprivation. The perpetrators utilized their physical advantage and psychological control to ensure she could not escape or call for help. The conditions of her confinement were bleak, characterized by a total lack of basic human necessities and continuous mistreatment. The human body is remarkably resilient, but it has absolute limits. Tragically, the prolonged exposure to these harsh conditions, combined with the severe injuries she sustained over weeks of captivity, eventually proved fatal. Fan Man-yee succumbed to the abuse, passing away alone in that Granville Road apartment. Following her passing, the individuals responsible faced the immediate and pressing problem of concealing their crime. In a calculated and deeply disturbing attempt to destroy evidence and avoid detection, they meticulously dismantled the scene. The perpetrators went to extraordinary lengths to obscure the identity of the victim and to erase any forensic link to themselves. They engaged in extensive thermal alteration of the remains, a clinical term for attempting to destroy biological evidence through heat. They disposed of the majority of the physical evidence through the city's waste disposal system, scattering the remnants across different locations to ensure they could never be fully recovered. However, they retained a crucial piece of forensic evidence. In an act that would later shock the public and give the case its media moniker, they concealed the remaining physical evidence within a large, mermaid-themed Hello Kitty plush doll, sewing it shut and leaving it in the apartment. For weeks, The disappearance of Fan Man-yee went largely unnoticed by the authorities. Given her transient lifestyle and the nature of her employment, her absence did not immediately trigger a formal missing persons investigation. The crime might have remained hidden forever, another unsolved mystery lost in the vastness of the city, were it not for the heavy toll of human conscience. The breakthrough in the case did not come from a patrol officer or a brilliant deduction by a seasoned detective. It came from a 13-year-old girl. This young girl, referred to in court documents as Ah Fong, was the girlfriend of one of the perpetrators and had been present in the apartment during portions of the captivity. The psychological burden of witnessing such systematic cruelty is immense, particularly for a juvenile whose cognitive and emotional development is still in its formative stages. For weeks after the crime, the young girl was plagued by severe insomnia and recurring nightmares. The trauma of what she had seen fractured her peace of mind, leading her to the realization that remaining silent was no longer an option. Driven by guilt and the desperate need to unburden herself, the teenager walked into a local police station. In the realm of law enforcement, walk-in informants, especially juveniles, are handled with a mixture of protocol and initial caution. Detectives must carefully evaluate the credibility of the statement, separating fact from potential exaggeration or confusion. When the young girl began to describe the events on Granville Road, the sheer magnitude of the allegations naturally invited professional skepticism. She spoke of a prolonged captivity, severe physical abuse, and the bizarre concealment of human remains inside a child's toy. Despite the extraordinary nature of the claims, the investigating officers recognized the genuine distress in the young girl's demeanor. Standard police procedure dictates that every credible tip, no matter how unusual, must be physically verified. A team of detectives and uniformed officers was dispatched to the Granville Road apartment to conduct a welfare check and a preliminary search. Upon arriving at the building, the officers navigated the narrow stairwell to the third floor. As they approached the door, standard protocol required them to announce their presence, but there was no response. Upon gaining entry to the apartment, the officers were immediately struck by the environment. The flat was in a state of extreme disarray, but more telling was the distinct, lingering odor. In forensic investigation, the olfactory senses of a seasoned officer are often the first indicator of a crime scene. The air was thick with the smell of strong chemical cleaning agents, a common indicator that someone has attempted to sanitize a location, mixed with the unmistakable underlying scent of biological decay. The officers conducted a methodical sweep of the premises, moving from room to room with their flashlights cutting through the gloom. It was during this systematic search that they noticed the large Hello Kitty plush doll resting against a wall. The doll appeared out of place in the grim surroundings of the apartment. Upon closer inspection, the officers observed that the fabric had been tampered with and poorly restitched. When they carefully examined the doll, the young informant's harrowing tale was confirmed. The officers immediately secured the premises, establishing a hard perimeter to prevent any contamination of the scene, and called in the Major Crimes Unit and the Forensic Pathology team. The transition of the Granville Road apartment from a residential flat to a highly secure crime scene marked the beginning of a monumental forensic challenge. The low-card exchange principle, a foundational concept in forensic science, dictates that every contact leaves a trace. The perpetrator takes something from the scene and leaves something behind. However, in this instance, the perpetrators had spent days intentionally attempting to erase those traces. The crime scene investigators, dressed in full protective suits, began the arduous task of processing the apartment. They utilized alternate light sources to search for latent biological fluids, swabbed surfaces for chemical residues, and carefully documented every inch of the space through extensive photography and videography. The most critical challenge, however, lay with the forensic pathology team. The primary objective of a forensic pathologist is to determine the cause and manner of death, and to positively identify the victim. In the case of Fan Man-yee, traditional methods of identification, such as fingerprinting or visual confirmation, were completely impossible due to the severe degradation and intentional destruction of the remains. The science of forensic anthropology had to be heavily relied upon. Forensic anthropologists specialize in analyzing hard tissues to determine the biological profile of an individual, including their age, sex, ancestry, and stature. The remains recovered from the scene were transported to the central mortuary under strict chain of custody protocols. The examination was painstaking. The thermal alteration of the evidence meant that much of the soft tissue, which could have provided clues about the specific physical trauma the victim endured, was gone. To establish a positive identification, the forensic team turned to odontology. Dental records are incredibly unique to each individual, functioning much like a fingerprint. By comparing the dental structures recovered from the scene with the known dental records of missing persons, the forensic odontologists were able to make a definitive match. The victim was officially identified as Fan Man-yee. With the victim identified and the crime scene processed, the investigation shifted from a discovery phase to an active manhunt. The police possessed the names of the suspects, provided by the teenage informant, and they rapidly mobilized resources to track them down. Law enforcement utilized a combination of traditional detective work, interviewing known associates, and monitoring locations frequented by the suspects. The pressure applied by the police dragnet was intense, and within a short period, Man-lok, Leung Shing-cho, and Leung Wai-lun were apprehended and brought into custody. The interrogation of the three suspects was a textbook example of police procedure when dealing with multiple co-conspirators. Detectives isolated the men in separate interview rooms, ensuring they could not coordinate their stories. In cases involving group criminality, perpetrators often attempt to minimize their own involvement while shifting the primary blame onto their accomplices. The detectives meticulously recorded their statements, cross-referencing the details against the physical evidence recovered from the apartment and the testimony of the young informant. The interviews revealed a chilling lack of remorse. The suspects admitted to holding the victim captive and participating in the abuse, but each claimed that the fatal actions were committed by the others. This shifting of blame is a common psychological defense mechanism observed in criminal syndicates, but it presented a specific legal hurdle for the prosecution. The judicial phase of the investigation took place in the High Court of Hong Kong, a setting defined by its solemnity and strict adherence to the rule of law. The trial gripped the attention of the public, dominating the news cycle. The prosecution faced a highly complex task. In common law jurisdictions like Hong Kong, to secure a conviction for murder, the prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt not only that the defendants caused the death of the victim, but that they did so with the specific intent to kill or cause grievous bodily harm. This concept is known in legal terms as mens rea, the guilty mind. The defense strategy capitalized heavily on the limitations of the forensic evidence. Because the perpetrators had successfully destroyed the majority of the biological evidence, the forensic pathologist could not state with absolute medical certainty the exact physiological mechanism that caused Fan Man-yee to pass away. The defense argued that the victim had a history of substance use, suggesting that a drug overdose could have been the actual cause of her passing, rather than the physical abuse. They argued that while the defendants were guilty of unlawful imprisonment and assault, the prosecution could not definitively prove the intent to murder, nor could they pinpoint which specific act by which specific defendant ended her life. To counter this, the prosecution relied on the legal doctrine of joint enterprise. This principle asserts that when a group of individuals embarks on a shared criminal endeavor, they are all equally responsible for the foreseeable consequences of that endeavor, regardless of who delivered the final blow. The prosecution meticulously presented the timeline of the captivity, utilizing the testimony of the teenage witness, who, despite her youth, provided a clear and consistent account of the systematic deprivation and abuse. They argued that the totality of the defendant's actions, the prolonged confinement, the denial of basic necessities, and the continuous physical trauma clearly demonstrated a reckless disregard for human life that was ultimately responsible for the death of the victim. The jury was presented with days of highly technical forensic testimony, legal arguments, and the harrowing details of the victim's final weeks. The burden of proof in a criminal trial is exceptionally high, and the jury deliberated carefully. After weighing the evidence, the jury returned their verdict. They found the three defendants not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter. Furthermore, the defendants were convicted of unlawful imprisonment and the prevention of the lawful burial of a body. While the public expressed some frustration that the murder charge did not stick, the legal distinction was a direct result of the high evidentiary standards required by the court, specifically, the inability of forensic science to determine the exact cause of death due to the perpetrator's own actions. However, the presiding judge, Justice Peter Nguyen, recognized the profound severity of the crimes. During the sentencing hearing, the judge delivered a powerful and resonant statement from the bench. He noted that in his many years of experience within the legal system, he had rarely encountered a case that demonstrated such profound cruelty, depravity, and a complete lack of human empathy. He emphasized that the actions of the defendants were a stark deviation from the basic tenets of humanity. To ensure the punishment fit the extreme nature of the offense, Justice Peter Nguyen sentenced Chan Man-lok, Leung Shing-cho, and Leung Wai-lun to life imprisonment, which is the absolute maximum penalty available for a manslaughter conviction in Hong Kong. The sentence was a strong message from the judiciary that while the exact mechanism of death could not be scientifically proven, the systematic destruction of a human life would be met with the full weight of the law. The aftermath of this investigation left an indelible mark on Hong Kong society. It sparked intense public discourse about the vulnerability of individuals living on the margins of society, the predatory nature of illegal debt collection, and the psychological impact of violent environments on youth, as evidenced by the 13-year-old informant. The physical location of the crime, the apartment building on Granville Road, became completely stigmatized. The profound psychological impact of the events that transpired there meant that no one wished to reside in or rent the premises. The building stood largely vacant for years, a silent monument to the tragedy, until it was eventually demolished and replaced by a new commercial development, an attempt by the city to physically erase the scars of the past. Yet, the legacy of the investigation remains a cornerstone in the study of criminal justice and forensic science. It highlights the absolute necessity of rigorous evidence collection, the vital role of forensic anthropology and odontology when traditional pathology is obstructed, and the heavy responsibility of the legal system to navigate the gray areas of intent and cause of death. Law enforcement professionals continue to study the procedures utilized in this investigation, particularly the handling of juvenile informants and the application of the joint enterprise doctrine in complex, multi-defendant cases. Most importantly, the process of the investigation ensured that Fan Man-yee was not forgotten. The perpetrators sought to erase her existence entirely, to reduce her to nothing more than hidden evidence. But through the conscience of a young witness, the meticulous dedication of crime scene investigators, the scientific expertise of forensic anthropologists, and the careful deliberation of the judicial system, her identity was restored. The truth of what happened to her in that Granville Road apartment was brought into the light, and those responsible were held permanently accountable for their actions. When we examine the intricate details of such an extensive investigation, we are forced to confront the dual nature of human capability. We see the profound darkness that can exist within individuals who choose to abandon empathy and exploit the vulnerable. But we also see the relentless dedication of those who stand in opposition to that darkness. The scientists, the detectives, and the legal professionals who piece together the truth from the smallest fragments of evidence. As we reflect on the incredible lengths the authorities went to, in order to uncover the truth and secure a life sentence under the charge of manslaughter, we are left to ponder a critical question. In an era where forensic science continues to advance at an unprecedented rate, leaving criminals with fewer and fewer places to hide their actions, how can society better protect its most vulnerable populations before a crime occurs? Rather than relying solely on the justice system to pick up the pieces after a tragedy has already unfolded,